Lighting doesn't have to be so hard or complicated. I'm a sucker for shiny, dramatic lighting, and I'm going to show you how to get results like these with just a few layers. Let's go. There's a few things to keep in mind in regards to lighting. Lighting isn't just about brightening up your piece. It's a powerful tool that can highlight your focal point and guide your viewer's eye exactly where you want it. Different colors of light can totally change the mood and emotion of your art. For example, warm tones might make a scene feel cozy or happy, while cool tones can give it a bit more calm or sometimes a more mysterious vibe. Also, the environment plays a huge role in how lighting works, whether it's an indoor or outdoor setting, time of day, weather, it all affects the light's color, intensity, and direction. So keep this in mind when planning your lighting setup. Alright, let's set up a few different lighting scenarios. I will be using Procreate, but you can use any drawing app or program that has layer modes. To keep things organized, I've set up a few different layer groups for each lighting type and added a simple background to help it tie all together once the lighting's done. Here's the drawing that I'll be working with. No lighting added yet, just basic shading. Let's take a quick look at the layer setup. From the bottom up, we've got the base colors for the skin and hair, and then a multiply layer for basic shading on a clipping mask, followed by the sketch layer that works as a bit of a line art. I love keeping the sketch visible in the final piece. And on top is the rendering layer, mostly for the hair details and the lashes. If you're interested in a more detailed video on my shading and rendering process, just let me know in the comments below and I can make it for you guys. I also have a longer, in-depth video on how I draw hair like this, so be sure to check it out on the description below. Now onto the first lighting scenario. Once your drawing's ready, it's time to dive into the lighting. Before adding any, you have to decide where the light will be coming from. I'll be starting with some bright sunlight first. I'm imagining this character outside around 3 p.m.-ish, bright sun but not directly overhead. I began by creating a new layer set to multiply. Make sure it's on a clipping mask so the shadows only affect the character and not the background. Since I decided the light is coming from the top right, I'll be erasing the shadows from areas on her hair, face, and body where the light hits, and you can see how it slowly starts to brighten her up. I also softened shadows on the left side a bit to reflect the bright indirect or ambient lighting that is hitting her on the left side. Next, I added a new layer set to overlay and focused on the section where the shadow meets the light, also known as the line of termination or terminator. Here I applied a saturated red tone. This effect is called subsurface scattering, and adding this makes the skin look more vibrant and lifelike. Now you'll probably notice some blue in the shadows of her face. I added this detail on a normal layer when I was experimenting, but I changed my mind and added it differently later on, and I'll show you here in a bit. On that same overlay layer I'll start adding some of the warmth back to her face using a red tone on the cheeks and a light orange on the right side of her face and hair. Then I added a new layer set to screen. Here's where the brightest highlights will be. I concentrated it on the rim light along her hair, shoulders, and the highest points of her face, essentially the areas where the light hits the most directly on the right side. Here's a trick I like to make highlights pop. I duplicate the highlight layer and apply chromatic aberration at about 15 to 20%. Then I use Gaussian blur to soften it slightly, and then I just adjust the opacity of both layers until the effect looks balanced. I feel like this makes it look a lot brighter and a bit more colorful. Finally, I felt it needed more warmth, so I created another overlay layer and lightly brushed with some orange onto her right side. On the same layer, here's where I added the soft blue fill light from the sky on her left side, and this gave it a bit more subtle and natural look than it did before, so I recommended doing it this way instead. In the end, I used one multiply layer for shadows, 2 overlay layers for warm lighting, and 1 screen layer for highlights, which was duplicated for the extra brightness effect. And here's the final result. My next lighting scenario is light coming through a window, with the character indoors and the sun almost ready to set. The process is similar to the last study, but this time I'll start with an overlay layer since the light is more prominent here than the shadows. I'll make it a clipping mask and gradually build up the light on her face using a saturated orange, adjusting the opacity as needed. Next, on a multiply layer, I'll add the shadows, beginning with the window pane patterns across her face and body. Along the edges of these shadow lines, I'll include a saturated red tone to show the subsurface scattering. Then, I'll continue adding shadows to areas the light doesn't reach, like parts of her body and hair. For highlights, I'll create a screen layer on top and apply the brightest light to key areas: her shoulder and the right side of her face where the window light hits directly. Using a blending brush, I'll soften the highlights to diffuse the glow. To create the shadow behind her, since she's leaning against the wall, I'll duplicate her character layer and set it to alpha lock and fill the whole thing with a light desaturated pink for the shadow. This is the same shadow tone I used on her as well. After positioning it to the left, I'll apply chromatic aberration for a subtle effect, then make sure to disable alpha lock and use Gaussian blur to about 5% to soften the shadow. Finally, I wanted to add a little extra brightness to the light, so on a new screen layer, I brushed some very soft orange onto her skin and the wall behind her and lowered the opacity a lot more for a subtle, intensified glow. For this scenario, I ended up using 1 overlay layer for light, 1 multiply layer for shadows, 2 screen layers for highlights, which can be merged to 1, and 1 duplicate layer for the shadow silhouette. And this is the completed look. Next up is another sunlight scenario. I love sunlight, but this time the sun is behind her with her face illuminated by the environment. Here are the references I used. I'm going to start with a multiply layer and adding soft shadows on the right side of her face to create some depth. Then on a new layer set to hard light instead of overlay, which I initially considered, I added the environmental light to her using a light blue shade. After softening it with Gaussian blur, I brought in some bright highlights to her face, focusing on areas like her eyes to give them a glossy look. Using hard light mode at a low opacity gave the lighting a subtle, less saturated and soft look, which is what I was going for. Then to balance it out, I did add warmth back to her face and cheeks and nose a little bit with a softer red. Next, I briefly went back to the multiply layer to add more shadows to her hair for additional depth before focusing on the brightest highlights. On that same hard light layer, following the reference, I created a glowing hair effect using yellows, oranges, and white. I started out with just yellow, then added white for the brightest highlights, and used orange as a smooth transition. This is also subsurface scattering, by the way. Are you getting it yet? It just makes it look so much better. I then added subtle blue hues at the top of her head to show the reflected light from the sky, and also refined the white highlights in her eyes for a little extra shine. Lastly, I couldn't finish this without an overlay layer, of course. I added one beneath the highlights, and with a soft orange, I brushed around her hair to make it glow a bit more and lightly applied it on her skin for warmth, adjusting the opacity until it felt just right. A lot of this is trial and error and just playing around with the colors and adjusting it until it feels right for you. And here's the final breakdown of the layers I used. one multiply layer for soft shadows, one overlay layer for warmth and glow, and one hard light layer for the main lighting and glowing hair. Here is how it turned out in the end. Next, we're diving into darker scenarios. This time will be candlelight and moonlight. Here's the main reference I used for inspiration. My process stays the same. I'll be starting out with a multiply layer for the shadows. Using a light blue shade, I do a light pass over the whole character, then gradually deepen the shadows on the right side to build depth. From there, I lightly erase areas where the candlelight hits most directly on the left, blending the edges with a soft brush to create smooth transitions. I repeat this process until it looks just right. By the way, I have all my references saved on my Pinterest board, so I'll leave it in the link below in case you want to check them out. Then I set the multiply layer to alpha lock and use a red shade to add, you guessed it, subsurface scattering. Next, I move on to an overlay layer to start adding in the light. With an orange shade, I paint the candlelight on the left side, slowly building up the lighting. Then, using a blue shade, I lay down the base for the rim light on the right side caused by the moonlight. This includes touches on her face, body, and hair. Now it's time for the brightest highlights. On a screen layer, I use a light blue shade to enhance the rim light along her hair and face. I make sure the lines aren't too thin, blending some of the edges while leaving others sharp for contrast. Soft and hard edges work together to create realism in lighting and rendering. On that same screen layer, following the reference, I'll go in with an orange shade and add some of the brightest highlights to the highest points of her face and some on her hair as well. Finally, I go back to the multiply layer to deepen the shadows further for a stronger contrast, concentrating them behind her nose, on her side, and darkening some areas of the hair as well. As a finishing touch, I use the curves tool to adjust the brightness and contrast, pushing the lights and darks to make it pop a little bit more. In the end, I used 3 layers for this lighting setup: overlay layer for candlelight and moonlight base colors, multiply layer for shadows, and screen layer for the brightest highlights. And that's it. Here's the result. And now onto the last lighting study. Lastly, we have this dramatic and colorful light. Here's a reference. You know the drill. We'll start with a multiply layer to blend the character into the background. First, I'll apply a soft light pass of blue over the entire figure. Then I'll set it to alpha lock and add red to the right side and areas on the left where the red light reaches through. Then, on a new layer, I'll set it to color, and this is the main layer that will make the biggest change in the overall color of this piece. I'll paint over the same areas I did as the layer below, going in with blue on the left and red on the right, keeping the opacity low. At this point, it totally reminds me of those vintage 3D glasses with one red and one blue lens. I also blend in some purple tone in areas where the blue and red overlap, because red plus blue equals purple. Now, I'll make another multiply layer on top. Here, I'll add the deepest shadows where the light doesn't reach. I'll be following the reference closely and add them in her hair and around her nose. Since the strongest light is the red light coming in through the right, her nose makes a cast shadow on the left side of her face. So I make sure to pay attention to all these details of the reference when I color this in. Once the shadows are placed, I blend them in with my blending brush to keep them nice and soft. Now on a new layer, I will set it to color dodge. Here is where I'll place the brightest highlights. I chose color dodge because I want the highlights to be very bright and saturated this time. I place them in areas where the light hit most directly on her hair, body, and face, alternating with both blue and red. I'm making sure to blend in those highlights into the face. I'm going in with some highlights on the highest points of the hair as well, with the blue on the left side and the red on the right side. I also go back quickly into the multiply layer to add some deeper shadows on the red side of the hair. Then I go back into the color dodge layer to add some final little stray hairs and highlights to the hair to make it pop a little bit more and stand out from the background. Before wrapping up, I always like to double check my values, especially now since we're working with such intense colors. To do this, I add a new layer, fill it with gray, and set it to color mode. This turns the artwork black and white. And now I can go into the light and shadow layers, and with the curves tool, I adjust the contrast by making the darks darker and the lights lighter until it looks just right. Remember this, if the values look good, then the colors will work, no matter which colors you choose. Talking about color, you can totally create a new look by changing the colors of the lights if you wanted to. Just select your color layer, then go to Hue, Saturation, and Brightness, and slide the hue bar to transform the palette completely. It's like creating an entirely different artwork. In the end, I ended up using one multiply layer for the initial shadows, one color layer for the main lights, another multiply layer for the cast shadows, and one color dodge layer for the brightest highlights. And here is the final result. Seeing all these portraits together, you can really tell how lighting changes the mood and the appearance of her features, making some of them seem larger or smaller depending on the scenario. Let me know in the comments which lighting study was your favorite. Personally, I think mine has to be the sunlight coming from behind her. It creates this really nice, beautiful glow in her hair. If you'd like to learn more about my process and want to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a wonderful holiday season, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.